Some childhood moments change everything, and this was one of them. When 8-year-old Clara pulled that old crate from the creek, she had no idea she was about to uncover a family secret that would break her heart. Inside were old letters and photographs of a woman who looked just like her grandmother. But when Clara asked about the woman in the pictures, the adults went quiet and changed the subject. For 60 years, Clara wondered about this mysterious relative who seemed to have been erased from her family's story. Now she's finally ready to tell what really happened and why some secrets are too painful to keep buried. What could drive a loving family to completely forget someone who clearly meant so much to them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1963 stretched before Clara like an endless promise, filled with the kind of lazy days that only exist in childhood memories and the rural South. At 8 years old, she had been deposited at her grandparents' homestead for the summer months, while her parents traveled north for her father's work. The old farmhouse sat like a weathered sentinel among the pine trees, its white paint peeling in gentle curls that Clara loved to pick at when no one was watching. Grandmother. Ruby moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children in these same rooms. Her hands were never idle, always quilting, canning, or tending to some domestic task that seemed to spring eternal from the very walls themselves. She wore her silver hair in a neat bun secured with bobby pins that Clara was fascinated by, often watching as her grandmother performed the morning ritual of pinning each strand into place with the precision of a craftsman. The quilting thimble on Grandmother Ruby's finger caught the morning light as she worked. It was silver, worn smooth by decades of use, and had belonged to her own mother before her. Clara often watched her grandmother's fingers dance across the fabric, creating intricate patterns that told stories Clara couldn't yet read. The thimble represented something Clara was only beginning to understand: the careful way women stitched together not just fabric, but family stories, traditions, and the very fabric of their lives. Grandfather Joe was a man of few words, but deep kindness. His hands told the story of a lifetime spent working the red clay soil of North Georgia, and his eyes held the sort of patience that comes from watching seasons change for 70 years. He would sit on the front porch in the evenings, smoking his pipe, and watching Clara chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. When he did speak, his words carried weight, and Clara had learned to listen carefully to the wisdom hidden in his quiet observations about weather, crops, and the way of things. The homestead itself sprawled across 40 acres of mixed farmland and forest. The main house was a simple 2-story structure built in the 1920s, with a wraparound porch that provided shade during the brutal summer heat. Behind the house, a vegetable garden flourished under Grandmother Ruby's careful attention, with rows of tomatoes, beans, and corn that Clara was expected to help tend. A small barn housed 2 milk cows and a handful of chickens, and beyond that, the property sloped down through a grove of pecan trees toward the creek that would change everything. Clara's parents, William and Margaret, had married young and were still finding their way in a world that seemed to change faster each year. William worked for the railroad, a job that required travel and provided stability but kept him away from home for weeks at a time. Margaret was a schoolteacher, practical and loving, who believed in the value of hard work and education. They saw the summer with Clara's grandparents as beneficial for everyone. Clara would learn the old ways and develop independence, while they could focus on William's career advancement without worrying about childcare. The extended family gathered most Sundays after church, creating a tapestry of relationships that Clara was still learning to navigate. There was Uncle Thomas, her grandfather's younger brother, who had never married and lived alone in town, but always appeared for Sunday dinner with stories that made Clara laugh. Aunt Louise and Uncle Robert brought their 3 boys, Clara's cousins, who were older, and treated her with the casual kindness reserved for little cousins who weren't quite old enough to be real companions. The women would cluster in the kitchen after meals, their voices rising and falling in the rhythm of shared gossip and family news, while the men gathered on the porch to discuss weather, politics, and farming with the serious attention these topics deserved. But even in this warm family circle, Clara sensed undercurrents she couldn't name. Sometimes conversations would stop when she entered a room, or she would catch worried glances between the adults that had nothing to do with her behavior. There were photographs on the mantelpiece that showed groups of people, but when Clara asked who certain individuals were, the answers were often vague or quickly changed to other topics. She had learned not to press too hard with her questions, sensing that some subjects were simply not discussed. The creek became Clara's favorite destination during those long summer days. It wound through the back of the property, shallow enough to wade in most places, but deep enough in others to harbor small fish and crawdads that delighted her endless curiosity. The water ran clear over smooth stones, and the banks were lined with willows and wild honeysuckle that filled the air with sweetness. Grandmother Ruby had given her permission to explore the creek freely, with only the warning to stay within sight of the pecan grove and to be back by dinner time. Clara developed elaborate games during her creek explorations. She would build small dams with stones and sticks, create tiny boats from leaves and bark, and spend hours turning over rocks to discover the small creatures hiding underneath. The creek held endless fascination, the way sunlight filtered through the canopy above, the sound of water moving over stones, and the sense of being in a world completely her own. It was during these solitary adventures that Clara first began to notice things that seemed out of place. Sometimes she would find objects that clearly didn't belong in nature. A rusty button, a piece of colored glass worn smooth by water, or fragments of pottery that suggested human presence in places where no one currently lived. She collected these treasures in her pockets, creating small museums on her bedroom windowsill that Grandmother Ruby would occasionally dust around with patient tolerance. The rhythm of life at the homestead followed patterns that had been established long before Clara was born. Early mornings began with Grandfather Joe milking the cows, while Grandmother Ruby prepared breakfast, usually eggs, bacon, grits, and biscuits that emerged from the oven, golden and perfect. Clara's job was to collect eggs from the hen house, a task she approached with the seriousness of important work. The chickens were temperamental creatures with distinct personalities, and Clara had learned which ones could be trusted and which ones required careful negotiation. Afternoons often found Clara helping in the garden, learning to distinguish between weeds and vegetables, understanding the importance of proper watering, and developing an appreciation for the slow miracle of growing food. Grandmother Ruby was a patient teacher, explaining not just the practical aspects of gardening, but the deeper satisfaction that came from nurturing life and providing for one's family. These lessons were delivered in the context of shared work, making them feel less like instruction and more like the natural passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. Evenings brought their own rituals. After supper, the family would gather on the front porch to watch the day fade into night. Grandfather Joe would smoke his pipe, Grandmother Ruby would work on her quilting, and Clara would play quietly with her dolls or simply listen to the adult conversation that flowed around her. These were the times when family stories emerged, tales of Clara's father as a boy, memories of difficult winters or particularly good harvests, and the gentle mythology that binds families together across generations. But even in these intimate moments, Clara noticed gaps in the family narrative. References to when the children were all home that didn't quite match the number of Clara's aunts and uncles she knew. Mentions of before the trouble that were never explained. Old photographs that showed more people than could be accounted for in current family gatherings. These mysteries didn't trouble Clara exactly, but they created a background awareness that her family's story was more complex than the version she was being told. The community beyond the homestead was small and tightly knit, centered around the Baptist church, where 3 generations of Clara's family had worshipped. Sunday services were followed by elaborate dinners on the church grounds, where Clara could play with other children, while the adults continued the social bonds that held the community together. Everyone knew everyone else's business, but this knowledge was held with a kind of protective discretion that Clara was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her family and their neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the house closest to the homestead, was a frequent visitor who brought news, borrowed sugar, and provided the kind of informal social connection that was vital in rural communities. She was a widow who had known Clara's grandparents since childhood, and her presence in their lives carried the weight of shared history and mutual dependence. Clara liked Mrs. Henderson, who always brought peppermint candies and who seemed genuinely interested in Clara's activities and observations. As the summer progressed, Clara settled into the rhythms of homestead life with the adaptability of childhood. She learned to gather eggs without getting pecked, to distinguish between the calls of different birds, and to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. Her hands grew rough from garden work, her skin tanned from long hours outdoors, and her understanding of the natural world expanded in ways that would influence her entire life. The creek remained her sanctuary, the place where her imagination could roam freely and where the adult world felt safely distant. She had claimed certain spots as her own: a large flat rock, perfect for sitting and thinking, a deep pool where minnows gathered in the shade, and a fallen log that made an excellent bridge to the opposite bank. These places became as familiar as the rooms of the house, and she moved through the creek environment with the confidence of someone who belonged there completely. It was in this state of settled contentment that Clara approached the morning that would change everything. The summer had found its rhythm. Her relationship with her grandparents had deepened into genuine affection, and she had achieved the kind of independence that comes from knowing exactly where you fit in the world around you. The creek called to her as it did every morning, promising new discoveries and the simple pleasure of moving water and dappled sunlight. As Clara prepared for another day of exploration, gathering her small collecting bucket and checking her pockets for the smooth stones she always carried, she had no way of knowing that this particular morning would uncover secrets that had been buried for decades. The moss-covered crate, waiting in the deeper pool near the old oak tree, had been patient in its hiding place. But the spring floods had finally shifted the creek bed enough to reveal its presence to curious 8-year-old eyes. The stage was set for discovery, though Clara moved toward the creek with nothing more than the anticipation of another pleasant morning in her private kingdom. The family was beginning their daily routines. Grandfather Joe heading to the barn, and Grandmother Ruby planning the day's cooking, while Clara slipped away toward the water with the freedom that summer mornings provide to children fortunate enough to have them. The morning mist still clung to the water when Clara made her way down to the creek, her bare feet finding the familiar path through the dew-soaked grass. The air carried the green scent of summer and the promise of another warm day, but something felt different as she approached her favorite stretch of water. The recent rains had been heavier than usual, and the creek ran higher and faster than she had seen it all summer. Clara noticed it immediately, a dark shape partially submerged near the deep pool where she usually looked for crawdads. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a waterlogged piece of wood, the kind of debris that floods often deposited along the creek banks. But as she waded closer, her curiosity piqued by the unusual shape. She realized this was something deliberately made by human hands. The object was a wooden crate, roughly the size of a shoebox but deeper, with metal hinges that had turned green with age and moisture. Moss had grown across its surface in thick velvety patches, and water weeds had tangled around its edges as if the creek itself had been trying to claim it permanently. Clara circled the crate cautiously, the way children approach something that might be wonderful or dangerous, testing the depth of the water and considering how she might retrieve this unexpected treasure. The crate was heavier than she had anticipated, waterlogged and settled deep in the creek bed mud. Clara had to brace her feet against the smooth stones to get enough leverage to work it free, and when it finally came loose, she nearly tumbled backward into the deeper water. The effort left her breathless and muddy, but triumphant in the way that only successful childhood adventures can provide. Carrying the crate to her favorite sitting rock, Clara examined her find with the careful attention of a young archaeologist. The wood was old. That much was obvious from the way it had weathered and the style of the metal fittings. The hinges were secured with a simple latch that moved stiffly but wasn't locked. Clara hesitated before opening it, seized by the sudden sense that some discoveries can't be undone, that opening this particular box might change things in ways she couldn't predict. But curiosity won, as it always does with 8-year-old girls who find mysterious boxes in creeks. Clara lifted the lid carefully, half expecting it to fall apart in her hands, and gasped at what lay inside. The crate had been lined with oilcloth that had protected its contents from decades of moisture. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a white cotton cloth, were treasures that made Clara's heart race with excitement and confusion. There were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had faded from blue to grey. Photographs in the sepia tones that Clara recognized from her grandmother's albums, showing people in clothing from an earlier time. And most intriguing of all, a silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished but intact. Clara lifted the locket first, drawn by its weight and the way it caught the morning light. It was engraved with initials EM in an elegant script that spoke of care and expense. When she managed to work the tiny clasp open, she found herself looking at a small photograph of a young woman with familiar eyes and a gentle smile. The woman was beautiful in the timeless way that transcends fashion and era. But what struck Clara most forcefully was how much she resembled Grandmother Ruby. The photographs in the crate told a story Clara couldn't quite piece together. Some showed the same woman from the locket in various poses and settings, standing beside a house that looked familiar, sitting in a garden that might have been the same one where Clara now helped tend vegetables, laughing with friends at what appeared to be a church picnic. Others included people Clara thought she recognized but couldn't quite place, faces that seemed related to her family, but belonged to no one she had ever met. Clara studied each photograph with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The clothing suggested the pictures had been taken in the 1930s, based on the styles she had seen in her history books at school. The backgrounds were definitely local. She recognized the courthouse in town in one photograph, and the old oak tree by the creek appeared in several others. These weren't pictures of strangers. They were pictures of her family, or people connected to her family, from a time before she was born. The letters proved more challenging for Clara's 8-year-old reading skills. Many were written in the flowing cursive that adults of an earlier generation had learned in school, and the ink had faded in places where moisture had penetrated the protective wrapping. But she could make out enough to understand that they were love letters, written to someone named Evelyn May, signed by someone whose signature was too elaborate for Clara to decipher clearly. One letter, clearer than the others, caught Clara's attention. "My dearest Evelyn May, your family may not understand our love now, but time will prove that what we feel for each other is real and lasting. I promise you that no matter what happens, we will find a way to be together. You are the light of my life, and I will wait for you as long as necessary." Clara read these words with the fascination of someone encountering adult emotions for the first time. She didn't fully understand the implications, but she sensed the intensity of feeling behind the carefully formed letters. Someone had loved this Evelyn May very much, and someone had saved these letters as precious things worth protecting. But who was Evelyn May? Clara searched her memory for any mention of someone with those initials in her family, but came up empty. The woman in the photographs looked enough like Grandmother Ruby to be a sister, but Clara had never heard of Grandmother Ruby having a sister. In fact, she had heard Grandmother Ruby say several times that she was an only child, which had always seemed sad to Clara, who couldn't imagine not having siblings. the mystery deepened as Clara continued exploring the crate's contents. There were other small treasures, a dried flower that crumbled at her touch, a small religious medal on a broken chain, and what appeared to be a ticket stub from a dance or social event. Each item seemed to tell part of a story that Clara couldn't quite grasp, like trying to understand a book when half the pages were missing. Clara's initial excitement began to mix with unease as she realized the significance of her discovery. This wasn't just a random collection of old things. It was someone's life, carefully preserved and hidden. Someone had thought these items were important enough to protect from time and weather, but hidden enough that they had remained undiscovered for decades. Why would someone hide such obviously precious memories? The sun climbed higher as Clara sat by the creek, surrounded by the evidence of a life she had never heard about. She carefully rewrapped each item and placed it back in the crate, but her mind was racing with questions. Who was Evelyn May? And why did she look so much like Grandmother Ruby? Why had these letters and photographs been hidden rather than kept with the rest of the family pictures? And most importantly, why had no one ever mentioned this woman who was clearly connected to their family? Clara's first instinct was to run back to the house and share her discovery with her grandparents. Surely they would be as excited as she was to find these lost family treasures. Perhaps Grandmother Ruby would be able to explain who Evelyn May was and tell Clara the story behind the hidden crate. Maybe this mysterious woman was a distant relative whose memory had simply been forgotten over time. But as Clara gathered the crate and prepared to return to the house, something made her hesitate. She thought about the way conversations sometimes stopped when she asked certain questions about family history. The vague answers she received when she inquired about people in old photographs, and the sense she had developed that some topics were simply not discussed in her family. What if this discovery fell into that category of things that weren't talked about? What if there was a reason these items had been hidden rather than displayed with pride? Clara was beginning to understand that families could have secrets, though she didn't yet grasp why anyone would want to hide something as beautiful as love letters and photographs of someone who was clearly cherished. Despite her growing uncertainty, Clara decided to share her discovery. After all, she was 8 years old, and keeping secrets from the adults who took care of her went against everything she had been taught about honesty and trust. She would show Grandmother Ruby the crate and its contents, and surely her grandmother would explain everything in a way that made sense, as Clara made her way back toward the house, carrying the moss-covered crate with its burden of mysteries. She had no way of knowing that she was about to witness the power of family secrets, to cause pain even decades after they were first buried. The morning that had begun with simple curiosity about an unusual object in the creek was about to become the moment when Clara first understood that the adult world was more complicated and more painful than she had ever imagined. Clara found Grandmother Ruby in the kitchen, as she always did this time of morning, preparing vegetables for the day's cooking. The familiar scene, sunlight streaming through gingham curtains, the steady rhythm of chopping, the comfortable silence that allowed for thinking, suddenly felt charged with potential for change. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, the crate clutched against her chest, gathering courage for what she somehow sensed would be a significant conversation. "Grandmother Ruby," Clara began, her voice carrying the excitement she couldn't quite contain. "I found something amazing down at the creek." Her grandmother looked up from her work, taking in Clara's muddy dress and the obvious weight of whatever she carried. "Did you now? Well, bring it over here and let's have a look. But wipe your feet first. I just mopped this floor." Clara carefully placed the moss-covered crate on the kitchen table, watching her grandmother's face for the moment of recognition and delight she expected. But instead of excitement, she saw something else entirely cross Grandmother Ruby's features, a flicker of something that looked almost like fear, quickly replaced by careful neutrality. "Where exactly did you find this, child?" Grandmother Ruby's voice had changed subtly, becoming more cautious. "In the deep pool by the big oak tree. The rain must have washed it up from wherever it was buried." Clara opened the crate eagerly, ready to share her treasures. "Look at all these old pictures and letters. And this beautiful locket, but as Clara lifted out the silver locket, Grandmother Ruby went very still. Her hands, which had been busy with vegetables moments before, now gripped the edge of the table. The color drained from her face in a way that frightened Clara, who had never seen her grandmother look so shaken. "Child," Grandmother Ruby said slowly, "where did you say you found this?" Clara repeated her explanation, but her enthusiasm was fading as she watched her grandmother's reaction. This wasn't the happy discovery she had imagined sharing. Something was wrong, though she couldn't understand what. Grandmother Ruby reached for the locket with trembling fingers, and when she opened it to reveal the photograph inside, she made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She stared at the image for a long moment, her lips pressed tightly together, before snapping the locket closed and setting it back in the crate. "These things shouldn't have been found," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left buried, Clara, but who is she?" Clara asked, pointing to the photograph spread across the table. "She looks just like you, Grandmother Ruby. Is she a relative?" "Why don't I know about her?" The question seemed to cause Grandmother Ruby physical pain. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "Clara, there are some stories that are too painful to tell, some people that it's better not to talk about. This is one of those times, but why?" Clara's 8-year-old mind couldn't grasp why anyone would want to forget about someone who was clearly loved enough to have their letters and pictures saved so carefully. She's beautiful, and someone cared about her enough to keep all these things safe. Why is that painful? Grandmother Ruby began gathering the items back into the crate with movements that were both careful and urgent. "Some things happened before you were born, things that caused a lot of hurt in this family. Sometimes the kindest thing to do is to let sleeping dogs lie." Clara watched in dismay as her grandmother rewrapped each item with the same care with which they had originally been preserved, but now with the clear intention of putting them away again. "Are you going to hide them again?" "I'm going to put them somewhere safe," Grandmother Ruby said, avoiding Clara's eyes. "And I need you to promise me something, child. Promise me you won't go looking for more things like this, and you won't talk about what you found today. Some secrets are kept for good reasons." The request troubled Clara more than she could express. In her 8 years of life, she had been taught that honesty was one of the most important virtues, that families shared everything with each other, and that secrets were generally bad things that caused problems. Now her grandmother was asking her to keep a secret, and Clara didn't understand why. But Grandmother Ruby, what if there are more things hidden? What if there are other pictures or letters that tell more of the story? "Don't you want to know?" The pain in her grandmother's eyes was unmistakable now. "Some stories are finished, Clara, and picking at old wounds doesn't help anybody heal. This is one of those times when you need to trust that the adults know what's best." Clara nodded reluctantly, but her mind was far from settled. As she watched her grandmother carry the crate toward the back of the house, presumably to store it somewhere out of reach, she felt a profound sense of loss. Not just for the mystery that would remain unsolved, but for something more fundamental. Her previous certainty that her family shared everything with each other, that there were no important secrets between people who loved one another. That afternoon, while Grandmother Ruby was busy with household tasks that seemed to require unusual concentration, Clara found herself drawn back to the creek. She couldn't stop thinking about the crate and its contents, about the woman named Evelyn May, who looked so much like her grandmother, and about the love letters that spoke of devotion and promises that apparently had never been fulfilled. Clara retraced her steps to the spot where she had found the crate, looking for any other signs that items might have been hidden or lost over the years. The pool where the crate had rested showed no evidence of other submerged treasures. But Clara noticed things she had overlooked before, in her excitement over the main discovery. There were stones arranged in patterns that didn't look entirely natural, as if someone had once created a small monument or marker. Some of the larger rocks showed signs of having been moved deliberately, and one had what appeared to be initials carved into its surface. Though weathering had made them difficult to read clearly, Clara also found wedged between the roots of the old oak tree, a piece of what had once been fine fabric, silk or satin, now deteriorated but still showing traces of what might have been embroidered flowers. It was as if someone had once spent time in this exact spot, perhaps reading letters or looking at photographs, and small pieces of their presence had been left behind. The discovery of these additional clues only deepened Clara's conviction that there was a story here worth knowing. Someone had treasured this place enough to visit it regularly, had considered it special enough to hide precious things here, and had cared enough about Evelyn May to preserve her memory even when, for reasons Clara couldn't fathom, the family had decided to forget her. As Clara sat by the creek in the late afternoon light, she made a decision that would shape the rest of her summer and, ultimately, the rest of her life. Despite her grandmother's request to let the matter rest, despite the obvious pain that talking about Evelyn May had caused, Clara couldn't bring herself to simply forget about this mystery. She would be careful and respectful, she told herself. She wouldn't upset her grandmother by asking direct questions or demanding explanations. But she would keep her eyes and ears open for any mention of Evelyn May, any clue that might help her understand who this woman was and why her existence had been erased from family memory. Clara was beginning to understand that adults sometimes made decisions based on experiences and knowledge that children couldn't fully grasp. But she was also beginning to understand that sometimes those decisions, however well-intentioned, created their own kind of pain, the pain of unanswered questions, of stories left unfinished, and of people who deserved to be remembered but had been forgotten instead. The faded love letter she had glimpsed in the crate haunted her thoughts. Time will prove that what we feel for each other is real and lasting. Someone had believed that their love would endure, had trusted that eventually the obstacles keeping them apart would be overcome. But apparently time had proved something different, and now even the memory of that love was considered too dangerous to acknowledge. As Clara made her way back to the house for supper, she carried with her not just the lingering excitement of discovery, but the heavier burden of her first real encounter with the complexity of adult emotions and the painful realization that families, even loving ones, could choose to bury parts of their own history. 3 days passed before Clara worked up the courage to approach Mrs. Henderson about what she had found. Those 3 days were filled with careful observation and growing frustration as Clara tried to detect any mention of Evelyn May in the conversations around her. She listened more intently to the adult discussions that flowed around the dinner table and on the front porch, hoping to catch some reference that might illuminate the mystery. But if anything, the silence around this particular subject seemed more complete than ever. Clara's opportunity came when Mrs. Henderson stopped by to borrow eggs for a cake she was making for the church social. The older woman was always friendly with Clara, treating her more like a person and less like a child than some adults did, which gave Clara hope that she might be willing to answer questions that others wouldn't. "Mrs. Henderson," Clara began carefully as they walked together toward the hen house, "have you lived here your whole life?" "Born and raised right here in this county," Mrs. Henderson replied, seeming pleased by Clara's interest. "And knew your grandparents when they were just children themselves. This community doesn't change much. The same families have been here for generations." Clara gathered her courage. "So you would remember all the family members, wouldn't you? All the brothers and sisters and cousins?" Something in Clara's tone must have alerted Mrs. Henderson to the fact that this wasn't idle curiosity. The older woman slowed her pace and studied Clara's face with the careful attention that adults reserve for questions that might be more significant than they appear. "I suppose I would," Mrs. Henderson said slowly. "Why do you ask, child?" Clara had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, she found herself struggling to find the right words. "I found some old pictures down by the creek, pictures of someone who looks like family, but I don't know who she is. Her name was Evelyn May." The effect of that name on Mrs. Henderson was immediate and unmistakable. She stopped walking entirely, her hand going to her throat in a gesture of surprise or distress. For a moment, She looked as shaken as Grandmother Ruby had been, and Clara felt a familiar sinking sensation as she realized she had stumbled into another painful subject. "Where did you find these pictures?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara explained about the crate in the creek, watching Mrs. Henderson's face grow more troubled with each detail. When Clara finished her account, Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long time, staring toward the creek, as if she could see across the decades to whatever memories Clara's discovery had awakened. "Child," Mrs. Henderson said finally, "there are some stones that are better left unturned. Some families have wounds that never quite heal, and picking at them doesn't help anybody." "But why?" Clara's frustration finally boiled over. "Why won't anyone tell me who she was? She was part of this family. I can see it in the pictures. She lived here, or at least visited here. Someone loved her enough to save all those letters and photographs. Why does everyone act like she never existed?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with compassion, but also with the kind of sadness that comes from knowing painful truths that can't be easily shared. "Because sometimes love isn't enough, Clara. Sometimes families have to make difficult choices, and those choices leave scars that last for generations." "What kind of choices?" Clara pressed, sensing that Mrs. Henderson might be more willing to explain than her grandmother had been. But Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "That's not my story to tell, child. If your family has decided that some things are better left in the past, then perhaps you should respect that decision." Clara felt tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. "It doesn't feel respectful to forget about someone. It feels mean." The observation clearly struck Mrs. Henderson, who reached out to touch Clara's shoulder gently. "You have a good heart, Clara, and you're right that forgetting about people isn't always the kindest thing to do. But sometimes families protect themselves the only way they know how, even when that way causes other kinds of pain." That evening, Clara's parents called during their weekly phone conversation, and Clara found herself wondering whether she should ask them about Evelyn May. But something held her back. Perhaps the memory of her grandmother's distress, or perhaps the growing sense that this was a secret that extended beyond just her grandparents to include the entire family. Instead, Clara found herself paying closer attention to the family Bible that sat on the table in the front parlor. She had looked through it before, fascinated by the family tree recorded in the front pages and the birth and death dates written in careful script. Now she studied it with new purpose, looking for any mention of Evelyn May. What she found was more confusing than illuminating. There were gaps in the family record that didn't make sense, places where it seemed like names might have been erased, or where the spacing suggested that entries had been removed. Clara's reading skills weren't sufficient to decipher all the faded handwriting, but she could see that the family tree as recorded didn't match what she knew about her relatives. The most troubling discovery came when Clara realized that some pages had been carefully cut out of the Bible entirely. The cuts were so neat and precise that she might not have noticed them if she hadn't been looking carefully, but once she saw them, it was obvious that someone had deliberately removed information from the family record. Clara began to understand that the erasure of Evelyn May from family memory had been systematic and deliberate. Someone had gone through family documents and photographs, removing all trace of her existence with the same care with which her treasures had originally been preserved. This wasn't simply a matter of not talking about painful memories. This was active destruction of evidence that Evelyn May had ever lived. The realization filled Clara with a sense of injustice that was new and overwhelming. In her 8-year-old understanding of the world, people were remembered after they died, their lives celebrated, and their stories told to younger generations. The idea that someone could be deliberately erased from family history seemed not just sad, but fundamentally wrong. That night, as Clara lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around her, she made a decision that would define the rest of her childhood and beyond. Whatever had happened to Evelyn May, whatever pain her existence had caused the family, Clara would not let her be forgotten completely. She might be too young to understand the full story now, but she would remember the face in the locket, the love expressed in those letters, and the fact that someone had cared enough to preserve these memories even when the rest of the family had chosen to forget. Clara also decided that she would continue looking for clues, but more carefully now. She had learned that direct questions caused pain and that adults could close ranks against curious children when they felt threatened by unwelcome inquiries. But Clara had also learned that secrets left traces, and if she was patient and observant, she might be able to piece together Evelyn May's story, without causing the kind of distress that her grandmother and Mrs. Henderson had shown. The hand-drawn map that Clara had glimpsed among the letters haunted her thoughts. She remembered seeing what looked like landmarks, the creek, the old oak tree, and what might have been buildings or special places. If she could find that map again, or if there were other clues hidden around the property, she might be able to understand why this particular place had been important to Evelyn May and whoever had loved her. Clara fell asleep that night, planning her investigation, determined to honor the memory of a woman who had been deliberately forgotten, even if she couldn't yet understand why such forgetting had been necessary. Clara's memory of the hand-drawn map proved to be remarkably accurate. She had only glimpsed it briefly before her grandmother closed the crate, but the image had burned itself into her mind with the clarity that important discoveries sometimes achieve. Over the next several days, Clara found herself drawn repeatedly to the area around the old oak tree, studying the landscape with new eyes and trying to match what she remembered of the map's details with the actual terrain. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when Clara noticed that the large flat rock where she had first examined the crate's contents was positioned in relation to the oak tree and the creek in exactly the pattern she remembered from the map. If she was right about this correlation, then there should be other landmarks nearby that would correspond to the symbols she had seen drawn in careful pencil lines. Clara began a systematic exploration of the area, moving in widening circles from the oak tree and looking for anything that might match her memories of the map. She found evidence of human presence that she had previously overlooked, stones that had been deliberately arranged, a depression in the ground that might once have held a bench or seat, and most intriguingly, a path worn smooth by footsteps that led away from the main creek toward a grove of trees she had never explored. Following the path required more courage than Clara had initially anticipated. It led away from the familiar territory around the creek into an area where the trees grew more thickly and the undergrowth was dense enough to hide whatever lay ahead. But Clara's determination to understand Evelyn May's story overcame her natural caution, and she pushed through the brambles and low-hanging branches toward whatever destination the path was designed to reach. The grove opened into a small clearing that took Clara's breath away. Someone had created a private sanctuary here, a place designed for solitude and reflection. The trees formed a natural cathedral, their branches interlacing overhead to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into gentle, dancing patterns. In the center of the clearing stood another oak tree, smaller than the one by the creek but clearly ancient, its trunk bearing the unmistakable marks of human attention. Clara approached the tree with the reverence that such places inspire, running her hands over the smooth bark and looking for the signs she somehow knew she would find. There, carved into the trunk at eye level for an adult, were the initials she had been hoping to discover. EM plus JR, surrounded by a heart that had been cut deep enough into the bark to survive decades of growth and weather. The discovery filled Clara with a mixture of triumph and sadness. Here was proof that Evelyn May had been real, had been loved, and had found happiness in this secret place. But the very secrecy of the location also suggested that this love had been hidden, conducted away from the family and community that should have celebrated it. Why had Evelyn May and JR needed to meet in secret? What had prevented them from declaring their love openly? Clara studied the initials carefully, tracing the carved lines with her finger and trying to imagine the moment when they had been created. The carving showed skill and care, This hadn't been a casual gesture, but a deliberate memorial to something precious. She could picture a young man working carefully with a knife to create this permanent declaration, while Evelyn May watched and perhaps protested that he would damage the tree. As Clara continued exploring the clearing, she discovered other evidence of its use as a meeting place. A fallen log had been positioned to serve as a bench, facing the oak tree in a way that would allow two people to sit together and admire their carved initials. The ground around the log was level and clear, suggesting that someone had maintained this space over time, removing weeds and debris to preserve its character as a sanctuary. Most significantly, Clara found what appeared to be the remains of a small fire pit, carefully constructed with stones and positioned safely away from the surrounding trees. The ashes were long gone, but the arrangement of stones and the slight depression in the earth told the story of evenings spent in this hidden place, perhaps sharing meals or simply talking by firelight. Clara's exploration of the clearing also yielded physical evidence that connected directly to the contents of the crate. Wrapped around the base of a small sapling, she found a piece of fabric that matched the ribbon that had tied the letters together. Weather and time had faded it almost beyond recognition, but the distinctive pattern was still visible enough to confirm the connection. Even more exciting was Clara's discovery of a small metal box, similar to the kind used for tobacco, hidden in a hollow at the base of the oak tree. The box was rusted and difficult to open, but Clara's persistence was rewarded when the lid finally yielded to reveal a few items that had been protected from the weather. A pressed flower, now fragile as tissue paper. A small key that looked like it might fit a diary or jewelry box. And most precious of all, a wedding ring. The ring was simple but beautiful, a plain gold band that had been carefully wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. Clara lifted it with trembling hands, understanding instinctively that she was holding something sacred. The ring suggested that Evelyn May and J.R. had been married, or at least engaged, which made the family's silence about her existence even more puzzling. Why would a family refuse to acknowledge a marriage? Clara's 8-year-old understanding of social conventions wasn't sophisticated enough to grasp all the possible reasons. But she knew enough about her community to understand that some marriages were approved of and others weren't. Perhaps J.R. had been someone the family considered unsuitable, too poor, from the wrong family, or of a different religion. But even if the family had disapproved of Evelyn May's choice, why would they erase her from memory entirely? Clara had heard stories of family members who had made disappointing marriages or life choices, but they weren't forgotten. They were simply discussed with sadness or regret. The complete elimination of Evelyn May from family history suggested something more serious than mere disapproval. As Clara sat in the clearing, holding the wedding ring and looking at the carved initials, she felt the weight of a story that was larger and more tragic than she had initially imagined. This wasn't just about a forgotten relative or a marriage that hadn't worked out. This was about love that had been forced into hiding, about promises that had been broken by circumstances beyond the lover's control, and about a family's decision to deal with pain by pretending it had never existed. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees when Clara finally made her way back toward the house, carrying the metal box and its precious contents. She had learned to be careful about her discoveries, to think before sharing information that might cause distress. But she had also learned that some secrets demanded to be revealed, that some stories were too important to remain hidden forever. Clara was beginning to understand that her discovery of the crate had been more than childhood curiosity satisfied. It had been the beginning of a responsibility that would follow her for the rest of her life. Someone needed to remember Evelyn May, to honor her story, and to ensure that her love and her suffering weren't forgotten completely. And it seemed that Clara, at 8 years old, had been chosen for that task. The pressed flower bookmark that Clara found tucked inside the small metal box became her most treasured clue. Unlike the other artifacts that spoke of romance and hidden meetings, this delicate pressed bloom, once purple, now faded to brown, had clearly been saved from a Bible or prayer book. The careful way it had been preserved, wrapped in tissue paper that bore the faint impression of text, suggested that faith had been important to Evelyn May, even in her suffering. Clara's discovery of the bookmark coincided with a noticeable change in her relationship with her family. The excitement and trust that had characterized her first weeks at the homestead had given way to a sense of carrying something heavy and secret. She found herself watching her grandmother's face for signs of the pain she had witnessed, studying her grandfather's quiet demeanor for any hint that he too carried knowledge about Evelyn May, and feeling guilty about her continued investigation into matters they clearly wanted left alone. The guilt was particularly sharp during their evening rituals on the front porch. As Grandmother Ruby worked on her quilting and Grandfather Joe smoked his pipe, Clara would sit with her dolls, but find herself thinking about the secret clearing and the evidence of love that had been forced into hiding. The comfortable family intimacy that had once made these moments precious now felt complicated by the knowledge that important things were being left unsaid. Clara's emotional state didn't go unnoticed by the adults around her. Her parents, during their weekly phone calls, commented that she seemed quieter than usual. Grandmother Ruby asked several times if Clara was feeling well, noting that she had lost some of her enthusiasm for the daily activities that had previously delighted her. Even Mrs. Henderson, during her visits to the house, remarked that Clara seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her young shoulders. The burden of secrets was indeed affecting Clara in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She had always been a child who shared everything with the adults in her life, who processed new experiences through conversation, and who trusted that her family would help her understand anything that confused her. Now she found herself holding information that she couldn't share, carrying questions that she couldn't ask, and trying to solve a mystery that everyone around her wanted to remain unsolved. Uncle Thomas's arrival for Sunday dinner provided Clara with an unexpected opportunity to learn more about her family's hidden history. Thomas was Grandfather Joe's younger brother, a bachelor who had spent his life working various jobs around the county, and who had always been Clara's favorite relative for his willingness to treat her as an equal rather than just a child. He had a reputation for speaking his mind and for having little patience with social conventions that he considered silly or harmful. Clara's opportunity came when she found Uncle Thomas sitting alone on the back porch after dinner, looking out toward the creek with an expression of thoughtfulness that seemed to invite conversation. She approached him carefully, uncertain how much of the family's conspiracy of silence he shared, but hoping that his generally honest nature might make him more willing to discuss difficult topics. "Uncle Thomas," Clara began, settling beside him on the porch steps, "do you remember everyone who used to live here when you and Grandfather Joe were young?" Thomas looked at her with the careful attention he always gave to questions that seemed to have deeper meaning than their surface suggested. "I reckon I remember most everyone," he said slowly. "Why do you ask, little one?" Clara chose her words carefully. "I found some old things down by the creek, pictures and letters that belonged to someone named Evelyn May. But when I asked about her, everyone got upset and said I shouldn't talk about it." The change in Uncle Thomas's demeanor was immediate, but different from the reactions Clara had seen from her grandmother and Mrs. Henderson. Instead of distress or fear, his face showed a mixture of sadness and what might have been relief, as if he had been waiting for this conversation for years. "So the truth is finally coming to the surface," he said quietly, more to himself than to Clara. "I always wondered if it would, eventually." "You knew about her?" Clara asked, hope rising in her voice at the possibility of finally getting answers. Uncle Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out toward the creek as if he could see across the decades to the time when Evelyn May had walked those same paths. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held sorrow. "Evelyn May was your grandmother's sister," he said simply. Your grandmother's younger sister, and one of the most beautiful, kind-hearted girls you could ever hope to meet. The confirmation of what Clara had suspected hit her with surprising force. But why doesn't anyone talk about her? Why does Grandmother Ruby say she was an only child? Thomas sighed deeply, and Clara could see him wrestling with the decision of how much truth to share with an 8-year-old child. Because talking about Evelyn May means talking about the worst thing that ever happened to this family, he said finally. And some people think that not talking about painful things makes them go away. But that doesn't make them go away, does it? Clara asked with the directness that children sometimes achieve. It just makes them secret and scary. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been admiration. You're a smart little girl, Clara, smarter than a lot of adults I know. He paused, seeming to reach a decision. No, it doesn't make them go away. If anything, keeping secrets about important things just makes them hurt longer and deeper. Will you tell me what happened to her? Clara asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. Thomas was quiet again, and Clara could see the conflict playing out across his features. Finally, he reached over and took her small hand in his work-roughened one. What happened to Evelyn May was a tragedy, Clara. Not just for her, but for everyone who loved her. And the way this family dealt with that tragedy was another tragedy, one that's been hurting people for 30 years. I want to know, Clara said with as much determination as she could muster. I want to understand why she had to be forgotten. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing her maturity against the difficulty of the story he would have to tell. The thing is, little one, he said finally, some stories are so sad that they change you just by hearing them. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of sadness? Clara thought about the love letters she had glimpsed, the carved initials in the secret clearing, and the wedding ring hidden in the metal box. She thought about Evelyn May's face in the locket, so full of life and hope, and about the careful way someone had preserved her memory even when everyone else wanted it erased. She was forgotten for 30 years, Clara said quietly. That's already sad. Maybe it's time for the sadness to be shared instead of hidden. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. You have an old soul, Clara, but this conversation needs to stay between us for now. Your grandmother has carried enough pain about Evelyn May without having to worry about you carrying it too. Clara nodded solemnly, understanding that she was being entrusted with adult knowledge and adult responsibility. The weight of secrets was about to become heavier, but it was also about to become shared, and somehow that made it feel more bearable. Uncle Thomas kept his promise to tell Clara the truth about Evelyn May, but he chose his moment carefully. It came the following Wednesday, when Grandmother Ruby had gone to town for her weekly shopping, and Grandfather Joe was working in the far fields. Clara found Thomas sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee and staring out the window toward the creek, with the expression of someone gathering courage for a difficult task. Sit down, little one, he said when he saw her. It's time you knew the whole story. Clara took her place at the kitchen table, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. Uncle Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of silence. Evelyn May was 19 when she fell in love with James Robert Patterson, Thomas began. Jimmy, we called him. He was a good man, honest, hard-working, kind to everyone he met. But he was also poor as a church mouse, and his family didn't have the kind of reputation that your great-grandfather thought was suitable for his youngest daughter. Clara listened intently as Thomas described the young man whose initials were carved in the oak tree. Jimmy had worked at the sawmill, saved every penny he could, and courted Evelyn May with a patience and devotion that should have impressed any father. But Clara's great-grandfather had other plans for his beautiful youngest daughter, plans that involved marriage to the son of a prosperous family from the next county, a union that would bring land and social standing to both families. Evelyn May tried to be obedient, Thomas continued. She really did. But love doesn't always follow the plans that parents make, and she couldn't bring herself to marry a man she didn't care for while her heart belonged to someone else. The secret meetings, in the clearing began to make sense as Thomas described how Evelyn, May and Jimmy had been forbidden to see each other openly. They had met in hidden places, exchanged letters through mutual friends, and held on to the hope that eventually Evelyn May's family would relent and accept their love. Jimmy was patient for 2 years, Thomas said. He worked extra shifts at the mill, saved money for a proper wedding, and even tried to approach your great-grandfather man to ask for Evelyn May's hand. But your great-grandfather was a stubborn man who believed that parents knew better than children about matters of the heart. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes as she began to understand the tragic direction of the story. "What happened?" she whispered. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "What happened was that love found a way, just like it often does. Evelyn May and Jimmy were married in secret by a preacher in the next county. They had witnesses and a proper ceremony, even if they couldn't have the celebration that Evelyn May deserved." "But that's wonderful," Clara said, confused about why this would be considered tragic. "They got married. They found a way to be together." Thomas's expression grew even more somber. "It would have been wonderful, Clara, if the story had ended there. But sometimes life has different plans than love does." He paused to pull a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a medical document that Clara recognized as the artifact that would change everything. She thought she knew about Evelyn May's story. 3 months after the secret wedding, Evelyn May discovered she was going to have a baby, Thomas continued. She and Jimmy were overjoyed, even though they knew it would force them to reveal their marriage to the family sooner than they had planned. Jimmy found a little house in town that they could rent, and they made plans to tell both families and face whatever consequences came from their disobedience. Clara waited for the next part of the story, but Thomas seemed to be struggling with words. When he finally continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. Evelyn May never got the chance to tell her family about the marriage or the baby. She died in childbirth, Clara. She and Jimmy had been married for only 7 months, and she died giving birth to their daughter in that little house in town, with no family around her except her husband. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She had been prepared for many possible endings to Evelyn May's story, but not this one. Death in childbirth was something that happened in history books, not to real people she had come to care about. The baby, Clara managed to ask through her tears. The baby lived, Thomas said. A little girl that Jimmy named Sarah May after her mother. But Jimmy was a young man with no family support and no way to care for an infant while working at the sawmill. He made the hardest decision of his life and gave the baby up for adoption to a family in Atlanta who could provide for her properly. Clara tried to process this information, but her mind was reeling with the implications. "So I have a great cousin somewhere? Evelyn May's daughter is still alive? If she survived childhood, she would be 30 years old now," Thomas confirmed. "Married, probably with children of her own. Children who are part of this family but don't know it." The revelation opened up new questions faster than Clara could formulate them. But why did the family erase Evelyn May from memory? Why not honor her and grieve for her properly? Thomas's face darkened with an anger that Clara had never seen from him before. "Because your great-grandfather was too proud to admit that his daughter had been right to follow her heart instead of his plans. When Jimmy came to tell the family about Evelyn May's death and the baby, instead of offering comfort or support, your great-grandfather ordered him off the property and forbade anyone in the family from ever speaking Evelyn May's name again." "That's horrible," Clara whispered, beginning to understand the true scope of the tragedy. "It was worse than horrible," Thomas said. "It was cruel and stupid and wrong. Jimmy was grieving the loss of his wife, desperate for help with a newborn baby, and hoping that family love would be stronger than family pride. Instead, he was treated like a criminal and left to face his sorrow alone." Clara thought about the love letters, the secret meetings, and the wedding ring hidden in the metal box. "Jimmy must have hidden those things by the creek," she said. "After Evelyn May died, he must have come back to save her letters and pictures." Thomas nodded. "I think you're right. I always wondered what happened to her personal things. Jimmy probably couldn't bear to keep them where he might see them every day, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy them either. Hiding them by the creek in the place where they had been happy together would have made sense to a grieving young man. What happened to Jimmy? Clara asked, though she was afraid of the answer. He left town after the baby was placed for adoption, Thomas said. I heard years later that he died in the war, but I never knew for certain. He never remarried, never had other children. I think he died of a broken heart long before he died in battle. Clara sat in silence for several minutes, trying to absorb the full weight of the story. Evelyn May hadn't just been forgotten. She had been deliberately erased because her love and her choices had challenged her father's authority. A young woman had died. Her husband had been destroyed by grief and rejection. And their child had grown up never knowing her real family. Or because pride had been more important than love or forgiveness. Does Grandmother Ruby know all of this? Clara asked finally. Your grandmother was only 16 when Evelyn May died, Thomas said. She loved her sister dearly, and Evelyn May's death nearly broke her heart. But she was still living at home, still dependent on your great-grandfather's support, and she had no choice but to accept his decision to never speak of Evelyn May again. I think it's been eating at her for 30 years, but she's never known how to break free from the promise she made to keep silent. Clara felt a new understanding of her grandmother's reaction to the discovery of the crate. The pain in Grandmother Ruby's eyes hadn't been fear of scandal or shame about family secrets. It had been the pain of being forced to forget someone she had loved deeply, someone whose memory she had been carrying in silence for 3 decades. Uncle Thomas, Clara said slowly, don't you think it's time for the silence to end? Don't you think Evelyn May deserves to be remembered properly? And don't you think we should try to find her daughter? Thomas looked at her with an expression that combined surprise, admiration, and something that might have been hope. You're asking for something that would require this family to admit they were wrong for 30 years. Clara, that's not an easy thing for people to do. But it's the right thing to do, Clara said, with the moral certainty that children sometimes possess more clearly than adults. Evelyn May was part of this family, and her daughter is part of this family, and pretending they don't exist doesn't change that. It just makes it sadder. As Clara looked at the medical document that Uncle Thomas had shared with her, she realized that her childhood discovery had revealed not just a hidden relative, but a fundamental choice that her family would now have to make: continue the silence that had caused 3 decades of pain, or finally honor the memory of a young woman whose only crime had been loving the wrong man, according to her father's judgment. The present-day Clara stood at the same creek where she had made her childhood discovery, watching her granddaughter Emma skip stones across the water, with the carefree joy that only comes to those who haven't yet learned how much pain families can carry. At 73, Clara had spent 6 decades thinking about that summer of 1963, about the secrets she had uncovered, and about the choices that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to love and forgive. The adoption papers that now rested in Clara's purse represented the culmination of a lifetime's quest. Finding Sarah May Patterson, now Sarah Collins, wife and mother of 3, had taken Clara 20 years of careful, patient investigation. In an age before internet searches and public records databases, tracking down a child who had been given up for adoption in 1934 required determination, luck, and the kind of stubborn persistence that Clara had inherited from both sides of her family. Emma's voice broke into Clara's memories. Grandma Clara, you've been staring at that water for 10 minutes. Are you thinking about something important? Clara smiled at her granddaughter, seeing in Emma's bright curiosity an echo of her own 8-year-old self. At 15, Emma was old enough to understand complex family dynamics, but young enough to still believe that most problems could be solved with honesty and good intentions. She was the perfect age to hear Evelyn May's story and to understand both its tragedy and its redemption. I'm thinking about a story I've never told you, Clara said, settling onto the large, flat rock that had served as her thinking place for 7 decades. A story about your family that I learned right here. When I was just a little older than you were when we first started coming to this creek together, Emma abandoned her, stone skipping, and came to sit beside her grandmother. Sensing the significance of the moment, Clara had always been a storyteller, but there was something different in her voice now. Something that suggested this particular story carried more weight than the usual family anecdotes. "It's about my great-aunt Evelyn May," Clara continued, "a woman who was supposed to be forgotten, but who changed the course of our family in ways that nobody understood until now." As Clara began to tell the story that had shaped her life, she found herself remembering not just the events of that summer, but the years that had followed. The teenage Clara, who had refused to let Evelyn May's memory die, who had spent hours in the town library researching adoption records and newspaper archives, looking for any trace of the baby who had been given away in 1934. Clara remembered the young woman she had been in the 1970s, newly married and starting her own family, but still driven by the need to find Sarah May and complete the circle that had been broken by pride and sorrow. She had written letters to adoption agencies, placed advertisements in Atlanta newspapers, and followed every lead that might connect her to Evelyn May's daughter. The breakthrough had come in 1983, when changes in adoption laws had made it possible for adult children to access their birth records. Clara had hired a private investigator, a luxury that had required saving money for 2 years, and had finally received the phone call that changed everything. Sarah May Patterson had been found, but knowing where Sarah was and knowing how to approach her had been 2 different challenges. Clara had spent months crafting the perfect letter, trying to find words that would explain 30 years of family history without overwhelming a woman who had grown up believing she was an orphan. The letter had been followed by phone calls, then by a tentative meeting in a neutral restaurant in Atlanta, and finally by the kind of family reunion that Clara had dreamed about since childhood. "I met her when you were 5 years old," Clara told Emma, watching her granddaughter's eyes widen with surprise. "Sarah Collins, your great-great-cousin. She's a retired teacher, just like your great-grandmother Margaret was. And she has your eyes, Evelyn May's eyes, the eyes that run in our family." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Why didn't you ever tell me about her before? Why haven't I met her?" Clara felt the familiar weight of family complications settling around her. "Because healing old wounds takes time, and some people in our family weren't ready to face the truth about what happened to Evelyn May. It's taken me 60 years to get to the point where I felt like the whole story could be told." The truth was more complex than Clara could easily explain to a 15-year-old. Sarah's existence had created ripples throughout the family that Clara hadn't anticipated when she first set out to find her. Grandmother Ruby, by then in her 80s, had wept with joy at the news that Evelyn May's daughter was alive and well, but she had also been overwhelmed by guilt about the decades of silence. Grandfather Joe, before his death in 1985, had expressed regret about his father's harsh decisions, but had never been able to bring himself to meet Sarah in person. Clara's own parents had been divided in their response to the reunion. Her father had embraced the idea of expanding the family and had welcomed Sarah warmly. But her mother had worried about opening old wounds and had needed years to feel comfortable with the idea of acknowledging what she saw as a shameful chapter in family history. Even Uncle Thomas, who had been Clara's ally in uncovering the truth, had struggled with the reality of Sarah's presence in their lives. He had been delighted to learn that Evelyn May's daughter had grown up in a loving home and had lived a happy life. But he had also been burdened by regret about the years that could have been shared if the family had made different choices in 1934. "The thing about family secrets," Clara explained to Emma, "is that they affect everyone differently. Some people are relieved when the truth comes out, and other people find the truth harder to bear than the secret was." Clara reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph that she had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it. The picture showed 4 generations of women standing together in Sarah's garden in Atlanta. Clara herself, Sarah's daughter Jennifer, and Jennifer's 2 young daughters. "This was taken last month," Clara said, handing the photograph to Emma. "Sarah wanted me to bring it to show you. She's been hoping to meet you for years, but she wanted to wait until you were old enough to understand the whole story." Emma studied the photograph with the intensity that teenagers bring to evidence of family connections they've never known about. "She does have our eyes," she said finally. "And Jennifer looks like she could be Mom's sister." "Genetics are powerful things," Clara agreed. "Even when families are separated, the bloodlines continue. Love continues too, even when it's interrupted by pain and misunderstanding." Clara had learned this lesson through decades of watching how Evelyn May's story affected the people who knew it. Sarah had grown up wondering about her birth parents, creating elaborate fantasies about why she had been given up for adoption and whether her biological family had ever thought about her. Learning the truth about Evelyn May's death and her father's grief had answered those questions in ways that brought both pain and peace. "I want to meet her," Emma said with the decisive certainty that Clara remembered from her own childhood. "When can we go to Atlanta?" Clara smiled, recognizing the family trait of curiosity and determination that had driven her own quest for truth. "Actually, Sarah is coming here next weekend. She's bringing Jennifer and the girls, and we're going to have the family reunion that should have happened 60 years ago." The plan had been months in the making, coordinated through phone calls and letters that had grown increasingly emotional as the date approached. Sarah had wanted to see the place where her mother had lived and loved, to walk the paths that Evelyn May had walked, and to visit the secret clearing where her parents had carved their initials in the oak tree. Clara had spent weeks preparing for the visit, cleaning the old homestead that she had inherited from her grandparents and gathering all the artifacts that told Evelyn May's story. The moss-covered crate now sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, its contents carefully preserved and catalogued. The love letters had been professionally restored. The photographs had been copied and enlarged, and the silver locket had been cleaned until it shone like new. Most importantly, Clara had convinced the remaining family members to participate in the reunion. Her own children and grandchildren were curious and supportive, excited about meeting relatives they had never known existed. Her surviving cousins had agreed to attend, some enthusiastically and others reluctantly, but all of them recognizing that the time had come to acknowledge the truth about their family history. The most significant victory had come when Clara's elderly Aunt Louise, now 91 and the last surviving sibling of Clara's father's generation, had agreed not only to attend the reunion, but to share her own memories of Evelyn May. Aunt Louise had been 12 when Evelyn May died, old enough to remember her clearly, and young enough to have been devastated by the family's decision to erase her from memory. "I've been carrying Evelyn May's ghost for 80 years, Aunt Louise had told Clara during one of their planning conversations. Maybe it's time to let her rest in peace by giving her the honor she deserved. Clara had also reached out to Mrs. Henderson's daughter, who still lived in the area and who remembered the stories her mother had shared about the family tragedy. The daughter had provided additional details about Jimmy Patterson and his desperate attempts to connect with Evelyn May's family after her death, painting a picture of a young man who had been broken not just by grief, but by the rejection of people he had hoped would become his family. He used to come by the house sometimes, Mrs. Henderson's daughter had recalled, just to sit on the creek bank and remember better times. Mama felt sorry for him, but she was afraid to show him kindness because of how your great-grandfather felt about the whole situation. As Clara shared these details with Emma, she watched her granddaughter's expression change from curiosity to sadness, to something that looked like determination. At 15, Emma was old enough to understand injustice and young enough to believe it could be corrected. "This is going to be emotional for everyone," Clara warned her granddaughter. Some people are going to cry, and some people are going to be angry about things that happened before they were born. Family healing isn't always pretty or comfortable. Emma nodded solemnly, but her eyes were bright with anticipation. It's still the right thing to do, though, isn't it? To bring everyone together and tell the truth about what happened. Clara felt a surge of pride in her granddaughter's moral clarity. Yes, it's the right thing to do. It's what Evelyn May would have wanted, and it's what Jimmy would have wanted. It's what love looks like when it's stronger than pride. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway of the old homestead. Clara looked up to see her son David getting out of his car, followed by her daughter-in-law and her other grandchildren. The family was gathering early, everyone wanting to be part of this historic moment. As Emma ran to greet her cousins, Clara remained sitting by the creek, looking down at the adoption papers that had made this reunion possible. The legal documents were typed on yellowed paper, formal and bureaucratic, but they represented the key that had unlocked 60 years of family secrets. Sarah May Patterson, born March 15, 1934, father James Robert Patterson, mother Evelyn May Patterson née Thompson, placed for adoption April 10, 1934, with William and Ruth Collins of Atlanta, Georgia. Those sparse facts had led to decades of correspondence, to careful relationship building, and ultimately to the kind of extended family that Clara had dreamed of since childhood. Sarah had not just survived her adoption, she had thrived, becoming an educator like so many women in the family, raising children who had gone on to successful careers and happy families of their own. But more than survival, Sarah had maintained the same qualities that had made Evelyn May special: kindness, curiosity, and a capacity for love that had survived even the trauma of being given away as an infant. Meeting Sarah had been like meeting Evelyn May herself. If Evelyn May had been allowed to live and grow and fulfill her potential, Clara stood up from the rock and walked toward the house, where her family was gathering for the most important conversation of her lifetime. Tomorrow, when Sarah arrived with her family, the circle that had been broken in 1934 would finally be complete. The woman who had been erased from family memory would be restored to her rightful place, and her daughter would finally know where she came from and why she had been given away. As Clara approached the house, she could see her family through the kitchen windows, talking and laughing as they prepared for the weekend that would change all of their understanding of who they were and where they came from. The weight of secrets that Clara had carried for 60 years was about to be shared among all of them, and somehow that made everything feel lighter. The moss-covered crate had done its work, rising from the creek when the time was right to reveal truths that needed to be told. Now it would serve its final purpose as the centerpiece of a reunion that would heal wounds that had festered for 3 generations. Clara paused on the front porch, looking back toward the creek where everything had started, and whispered a promise to the memory of Evelyn May. "Your story is going to be told, and your daughter is coming home." Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect summer day that seems designed for important occasions. Clara had been awake since before sunrise, moving through the old homestead with the nervous energy that comes from knowing that everything is about to change. The family photograph that would serve as the culmination artifact of their reunion sat ready on the mantelpiece, waiting to capture a moment that had been 60 years in the making. Emma found her grandmother in the kitchen at 6 o'clock, standing at the window and watching the driveway, as if she could will Sarah's car to appear through sheer concentration. The table was already set for 20 people, with the good china that had belonged to Grandmother Ruby and flowers from the garden that Evelyn May had once helped tend. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked, settling beside Clara at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that made her feel grown up and important. "Terrified," Clara admitted with a laugh that was half excitement and half anxiety. "I've been planning this day for 60 years, but now that it's here, I can't quite believe it's really happening." The morning hours passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Clara's children and grandchildren arrived early, each family bringing covered dishes and the kind of nervous excitement that accompanies historic family events. Uncle Thomas, now 87 but still sharp as a tack, positioned himself on the front porch where he could watch for Sarah's arrival and serve as the family's official greeter. At 11 o'clock, a silver sedan turned into the driveway and Clara felt her heart leap into her throat. Through the windshield, she could see Sarah's familiar face, older now than when they had first met, but still bearing the unmistakable family resemblance that had made their initial meeting so emotionally overwhelming. The car doors opened, and Sarah stepped out first, followed by her daughter Jennifer and Jennifer's two young daughters. 3 generations of Evelyn May's descendants, returning to the place where their family story had begun and been interrupted so tragically. Clara walked toward the car slowly, drinking in the sight of Sarah's face and marveling again at how much she resembled the woman in the locket. At 69, Sarah had the same gentle eyes and quiet dignity that had made Evelyn May so beloved, and seeing her standing in front of the old homestead felt like witnessing a miracle. "Welcome home," Clara said simply, and then the two women were embracing with the fierce joy of relatives who had found each other across decades of separation. "I can't believe I'm really here," Sarah whispered against Clara's shoulder. "I've dreamed about this place for so long, but seeing it in person is almost overwhelming." Emma approached hesitantly, suddenly shy in the presence of the great-great-cousin she had just learned about. But Sarah's warm smile and immediate hug dissolved any awkwardness, and soon the two were talking as if they had known each other forever. "You have Evelyn May's eyes," Sarah told Emma, studying her face with the wonder of someone discovering family traits that had been lost for generations. "And her curious spirit, from what your grandmother tells me." The introductions continued as more family members gathered around the car, and Clara watched with deep satisfaction as Sarah was welcomed into the circle that should have included her from birth. Jennifer and her daughters were absorbed into the crowd of cousins and second cousins, creating instant connections and the kind of easy family bonding that transcends years of separation. Uncle Thomas was the last to approach Sarah, and Clara held her breath as the two elderly relatives faced each other for the first time. Thomas had been 18 when Evelyn May died, old enough to remember her clearly and to carry guilt about the family's treatment of her husband and child. "You look just like her," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like your mother when she was young and happy before everything went wrong." Sarah took his weathered hands in hers. "Tell me about her," she said. "Tell me what she was like when you were all young together." As Thomas began to share his memories of Evelyn May, her laughter, her kindness, her love of music and flowers, Clara felt a profound sense of completion. This was what she had dreamed of since she was 8 years old. Evelyn May's family gathered together, sharing stories and memories, honoring the life that had been cut short and the love that had endured despite decades of silence. The morning passed in a blur of conversation and tears, as Sarah learned details about her mother that she had wondered about her entire life. She discovered that Evelyn May had loved to sing, that she had been an accomplished seamstress, and that she had dreamed of traveling to places far from the rural Georgia where she had been born. But most importantly, Sarah learned that she had been wanted and loved, that her parents' marriage had been real and legitimate, and that her placement for adoption had been born of grief and desperation, rather than shame or abandonment. "Your father loved your mother more than life itself," Clara told Sarah as they sat together on the front porch where 3 generations of family conversations had taken place. "And he loved you too. Giving you up nearly killed him, but he wanted you to have the kind of life he couldn't provide as a grieving young widower." As the afternoon approached, Clara knew it was time to share the most important part of Evelyn May's story, the visit to the secret clearing where love had flourished despite family opposition, and where the carved initials still proclaimed a devotion that had survived even death. The procession to the secret clearing felt like a pilgrimage, with 3 generations of family members following the path that Clara had first discovered as a curious 8-year-old. Sarah walked beside Clara, her hand clutching a small leather journal that would become the final and most precious artifact in Evelyn May's story, her personal diary, preserved for 60 years by Jimmy Patterson's family and recently discovered in an attic in South Carolina. Emma stayed close to her grandmother, sensing the profound significance of this moment. The clearing looked exactly as Clara remembered it from her childhood, though the trees had grown taller and the carved initials had stretched and faded with the oak tree's growth. But the sense of sanctuary remained, the feeling that this was a place where love had been pure and uncomplicated, even when the world around it was full of obstacles. "This is where they met," Clara explained to Sarah, pointing to the fallen log that still served as a natural bench, "where they planned their future and promised to love each other no matter what happened." Sarah approached the oak tree slowly, tracing the carved letters EM plus JR with trembling fingers. The initials were weathered but still clearly visible, a testament to the permanence of love even when lives are cut short. "I found a box of letters in my adoptive father's papers after he died," Sarah said quietly. "Letters from a man named Jimmy Patterson, who had been trying to reach me for years through the adoption agency. He never stopped looking for me, never stopped hoping that someday I would want to know about my real parents." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes as Sarah opened the leather journal. Jimmy had not only preserved Evelyn May's diary, he had added his own entries over the years, creating a record of grief, love, and hope that spanned decades. "He wrote to me in this diary," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Letters he could never send, because he didn't know where I was or whether I would want to hear from him. But he kept writing, telling me about my mother, about their love, about how much they both wanted me." Sarah began to read from one of Jimmy's entries. Dated 1950, Sarah May would be 16 today. "I wonder if she's tall like her mother, if she has Evelyn May's gentle spirit. I hope her adoptive parents have told her she's loved, that she wasn't given away because she wasn't wanted. I hope someday she'll understand that letting her go was the hardest thing I ever did. But I wanted her to have the chances that a poor, heartbroken young man couldn't provide." The family gathered in the clearing, listened in profound silence as Sarah shared more entries from the diary. Jimmy had never remarried, had never had other children, but he had built a life around the memory of his brief marriage and the daughter he had been forced to give away. He had become a teacher, dedicating his life to other people's children while never forgetting his own. Most remarkably, Jimmy had maintained hope even into his final years that somehow, someday, his daughter would find her way back to him. His last diary entry, written just weeks before his death in 1987, expressed gratitude for the love he had known with Evelyn May and continued faith that love transcends even death. "He died 3 years before I found this family," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. 3 years too soon to know that his prayers had been answered, that his daughter had grown up happy and loved, and that she never stopped wondering about him. Emma moved closer to Sarah, offering the wordless comfort that teenagers sometimes provide more naturally than adults. The sight of her granddaughter embracing this newly discovered relative filled Clara with a profound sense of completion. The circle that had been broken by pride and grief was finally being restored by love and forgiveness. Uncle Thomas stepped forward with his own confession. "I saw Jimmy once, years after Evelyn May died," he said quietly. "He was sitting by the creek, just sitting there with tears running down his face. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him how sorry I was about everything that had happened. But I was young and scared, and I didn't have the courage to go against my father's wishes." The admission hung in the air, like a prayer for forgiveness, and Sarah reached out to take Uncle Thomas's hand. "Oh, you were just a boy," she said gently, "and you've spent your whole life carrying regret about something that wasn't your fault." As the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above them, The family began sharing memories and stories that wove together decades of separate experiences into a single, coherent narrative. Sarah learned about her mother's childhood, about the family traditions she had missed, and about the relatives who had wondered about her for 60 years. But most importantly, she learned that love had never stopped flowing toward her, even when silence and separation had made that love impossible to express. Evelyn May's story was finally complete, not with tragedy and erasure, but with reunion and the kind of healing that can only come when truth is finally allowed to overcome pride. The carved initials on the oak tree no longer marked a secret love affair, but a family's foundation. The beginning of a story that had taken 60 years to find its proper ending. 1 year later, Clara stood in the same spot by the creek, but this time she wasn't alone with memories and regrets. The new family quilt that stretched across the picnic table represented everything that had changed since Sarah's first visit. A collaborative artwork created by all the women in the now reunited family, each contributing squares that told part of their shared story. Emma had insisted on including a square that depicted the moss-covered crate, carefully embroidered with silver thread to represent the way it had caught the morning light on that transformative day in 1963. Sarah had contributed a square showing the oak tree with the carved initials, while Jennifer had created a beautiful representation of Evelyn May based on the photographs from the locket. "It's perfect," Sarah said, running her hands over the intricate stitchwork that bound together not just fabric, but decades of separation and silence. Mother would have loved being part of something like this. The quilt would hang in Sarah's home in Atlanta, but copies of the pattern had been made for each family branch, ensuring that Evelyn May's story would be preserved and passed down to future generations. No longer would children grow up unaware of their heritage or wondering about missing relatives. Clara watched her granddaughter Emma teaching Sarah's great-granddaughters how to skip stones in the creek, marveling at how easily the children had accepted their expanded family. For them, having new cousins was simply a wonderful surprise, not a complicated resolution to decades of family trauma. "I keep thinking about what might have been different," Sarah said quietly, settling beside Clara on the familiar flat rock. "If the family had accepted Jimmy from the beginning, if pride hadn't been more important than love, if I had grown up here with all of you." Clara nodded, understanding the temptation to reimagine the past. She had spent 60 years playing the same mental game, wondering how different all their lives might have been if her great-grandfather had chosen compassion over control. "But you grew up with parents who loved you deeply," Clara reminded her. "You became a teacher, just like your mother dreamed of becoming. You raised children who are good, kind people, and you lived a life full of purpose and meaning. Maybe the path was harder than it should have been, but it led you to exactly where you needed to be." The wisdom of acceptance had come slowly to Clara, earned through decades of carrying anger about injustices that couldn't be changed. She had finally learned that healing came not from rewriting the past, but from choosing love in the present, not from fixing what was broken, but from building something new from the pieces that remained. "Besides," Clara continued with a smile, "if you had grown up here, you might never have met your husband, and then Jennifer wouldn't exist, and her daughters wouldn't exist, and our family would be different in ways we can't even imagine." Emma's laughter echoed across the water as one of her new little cousins successfully skipped a stone 3 times. The sound filled Clara with profound gratitude for the chain of events that had led to this moment, from a curious 8-year-old's discovery of a hidden, great to a family reunion that had healed wounds no one had even realized they were carrying. The changes in the family had been remarkable to witness. Uncle Thomas, now 88, had found a new lease on life through his relationship with Sarah and her family. Having someone to share his memories of Evelyn May with had lifted a burden of silence that had weighed on him for most of his adult life. Clara's own children and grandchildren had embraced their expanded family with enthusiasm. organizing regular visits and maintaining the kind of close relationships that made geography irrelevant. Email and phone calls kept the family connected between visits, ensuring that no one would ever again feel isolated or forgotten. Most remarkably, the family had established a memorial garden on the site of the old homestead, with a bench positioned so that visitors could sit and look toward the creek where everything had begun. A simple plaque honored Evelyn May's memory. Evelyn May Patterson, beloved daughter, wife, and mother. Her love lives on in the family she never got to know. The memorial had become a gathering place for family celebrations and quiet reflection, a physical reminder that some love is strong enough to survive even death and decades of silence. Children who had never known Evelyn May now grew up hearing stories about their ancestor who had fought for love and whose memory had brought the family together. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that comes from completing a life's work. The 8-year-old girl who had pulled a moss-covered crate from the creek had grown into a woman who had spent 60 years ensuring that no one would be forgotten, that no love would be erased, and that family bonds would prove stronger than family pride. Emma approached the rock where Clara and Sarah sat, her face glowing with the joy of a perfect day spent with people she loved. "Grandma Clara," she said, "when I have children someday, I'm going to tell them about Evelyn May and about how you found her story in the creek. I'm going to make sure they know that families should never forget about each other, no matter what happens." Clara smiled, seeing in her granddaughter's determination an echo of her own childhood resolve to honor the memory of a forgotten relative. The circle was indeed complete, not just the reunion of separated family members, but the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. "That's exactly what Evelyn May would have wanted," Clara said, pulling Emma close for a hug that encompassed 60 years of love, loss, and redemption. For her story to be told, for her memory to live on, and for love to win in the end. As the family gathered their belongings and prepared to return to the house for supper, Clara took one last look at the creek where everything had started. The water continued its eternal flow, carrying memories and secrets toward destinations unknown, but no longer carrying the weight of Evelyn May's forgotten story. Some childhood moments really do change everything, and the ripples from those moments can spread across decades, touching lives and healing hearts in ways that no one could have imagined. The moss-covered crate had done its work, and the family that had been broken by pride and silence was finally beautifully whole.